They told him to peel the flag off the coffin. The words hit like a rifle crack in a quiet church, and Captain Thomas Hale felt the air in his chest reroute itself from breath into something heavier and angrier, something that tasted like metal as the conveyor rattled behind the counter, and the terminal's loudspeaker droned its bright lies about on-time departures. He stood at the airline desk in full-dress uniform, ribbon bars aligned, shoes polished to the color of whetstone, and the flag on the transfer case behind him lay with a solemn weight he could feel even without touching it, a red and white and blue promise that no one was allowed to break. The counter agent kept her voice low as if kindness could hide the insult, repeating that the flag was a covering, and coverings were not permitted, that the casket needed to move like normal, luggage, that the system would not scan a thing with fabric, air-attached, and Thomas heard each syllable, the way he had once heard a helicopter's rotors counting down, seconds over a hot landing zone. Cold math in the face of human cost, and he lifted his chin and said, "The flag stays and the casket travels with me." And the agent's smile slipped like a glove too small for the hand wearing it. Passengers surged around him with the practiced drift of people who move through airports as if through a predictable dream, rolling their carry-ons, texting their families, buying gum and bottled water. And yet a few of them slowed as if their feet felt what their eyes had not yet seen, that a man in a uniform and a flag-draped case meant the ordinary morning had been pierced. He could feel the eyes, could feel judgment and curiosity and a few quiet prayers, and still he kept his focus on the agent whose name tag said Marcy, who now mentioned a supervisor, who said policy and compliance and forms, the soft words that had always irritated him more than shouted threats because soft words are what people use when they want to wash their hands while you do the bleeding. He placed one gloved hand on the aluminum rail of the stanchion, and the other on the corner of the case and felt the cool metal steady him. And a memory tried to climb out of its cage, a face under desert glare, a grin edged with dust, a voice saying, "Sir, you go first, I got you covered," and he crushed the memory because it was a floodgate he could not afford to open here. He had a timetable that could not be missed. A small town 3 states away where a mother had scrubbed the porch steps at dawn, and neighbors were setting folding chairs on lawns, and the honor guard had ironed their gloves, and the sun would set whether or not they were ready. And Thomas had promised to bring this boy home before dark. The supervisor arrived in a tailored suit with a smile that belonged in a brochure, and a tone that suggested he negotiated with weather, and thought himself successful at it. And he asked for documentation that Thomas had already provided twice, then asked to verify chain of custody, then suggested rebooking to a later flight because the process must protect everyone. And Thomas listened and nodded once and said, "This casket will not miss this flight." And the supervisor kept smiling and said, "Please step aside while we sort this out." And Thomas said, "I will not leave him." The supervisor's smile faltered and he mentioned security. And that was when a man standing nearby, denim jacket, worn ball cap, scar on his cheek like a pale river, said out loud the thing everyone else had been whispering, that the man in uniform was escorting a fallen soldier, and the airline should show respect. And the sound of the words "fallen soldier" changed the air around the counter like a drop in pressure before a storm. A few phones lifted, screens bright as moth wings, and the supervisor glanced at them and recalculated and said he understood the optics, while Thomas felt the burn of that word, the way a blade burns its sheath. Because optics are for glass and image and vanity, and what lay beneath the flag was a boy whose name had weight and breath, not optics. He leaned closer, lowering his voice until it was almost intimate, and told the supervisor what would not be said into any microphone. That the boy in this case once carried a man to safety while rounds stitched the sand, and that man was now wearing this uniform and had sworn to carry him home, and if anyone or anything tried to stop that oath, a reckoning would follow. Measured not in hashtags but in the kind of quiet consequences that outlast a news cycle, and the supervisor blinked, and for an instant, Thomas saw the human being behind the rules. Then the radios on the belts of the nearby agents crackled with summons, and 2 security officers angled through the crowd with the careful swagger of men who know cameras are watching, and the boarding announcement for Flight 177 to Louisville rolled across the ceiling speakers with the bright cheerfulness of a town crier at a hanging. And the agent named Marcy said, "Sir, if you would step to the side." And Thomas didn't move because stepping aside had never saved anyone he loved. And the memory he had tried to keep leashed lunged forward, and he saw once more the dust plume of a vehicle hit, and the sky made of white heat, and Liam Carter's voice saying, "Sir." Go, and Thomas had gone when the boy told him to, and the boy had not. He felt the weight of that choice grip his ribs and squeeze, and he set both hands on the case as if to anchor the earth and said clearly, so that anyone recording would capture not just sound, but the resolve inside it. The flag stays, the casket boards with me, and this flight will carry him home. And in the second after he finished speaking, an elderly woman near the rope line began to clap once slow and deliberate, and others joined, and the terminal gathered itself on the edge of a choice that would decide what kind of day this would be, and what kind of people they were willing to become. The rising conflict, bureaucracy versus honor. The clapping began as a ripple but swelled into a low tide of defiance that neither management nor security had planned for. People rose from their seats in the waiting area, phones still up, some with hands pressed to hearts, others whispering prayers they hadn't spoken in years. The two security officers froze mid-step, unsure whether to enforce rules or follow conscience. Thomas stood like a statue carved out of memory, the flag between his hands glowing faintly in the fluorescent light that made everything else look artificial. The supervisor's earpiece crackled again, an urgent voice whispering about optics, reputation, media sensitivity. He looked at Thomas, then at the crowd, then back again, and made the fatal mistake of trying to reason with a man who had buried too many reasons to count. "Sir, we can make arrangements for the next flight," the supervisor said, his tone slipping between diplomacy and control. "You'll still arrive tonight." Thomas's eyes did not blink. He was promised home before sunset. "But this isn't a matter of promise." It is only a matter of promise," Thomas said, voice level but carrying a gravity that silenced even the murmuring passengers. "You wouldn't understand what that means until you've had to make one to a dying man." Something trembled inside the room. Not sound, but awareness. The crowd leaned closer like witnesses at a sacred threshold. The supervisor stepped back. The moment held, taut and fragile, until a woman in airline colors whispered urgently into his ear. His eyes darted toward a frosted glass office down the corridor. From that office emerged a woman in a tailored navy suit, her badge gold, her posture sharpened by years of command. Regional Operations Director. Her name tag read R. Langford, and the instant Thomas saw her eyes, something old and unsettled inside him jolted awake. Recognition, faint but unmistakable. He didn't know her name then, but the cadence of her voice when she spoke sliced through the noise of the terminal like the echo of a distant battlefield. "Captain Hale," she said smoothly, "I understand you're escorting a soldier home. I appreciate your service, but we have federal transport protocols to follow. I need you to comply so we can ensure the integrity of the process." Her tone was professional, rehearsed, yet behind it was something else, something colder. Thomas stared, searching memory. And then it came, not her face but the voice. 12 years earlier, on a broken radio line outside Kandahar, he'd heard a logistics officer deny an emergency medevac. "Insufficient authorization," the voice had said while a wounded unit waited under fire. 2 soldiers bled out that night. Thomas swallowed. "Langford," he said softly, tasting the name like rust. "You were in Logistics Command. Afghanistan, 2013. Her expression didn't move. "I was stationed overseas, yes. A long time ago." "You left us stranded," he said, almost to himself. "That was your voice on the comms." The supervisor blinked, glancing between them. The silence grew thick, electric. Langford adjusted her jacket, the motion crisp, mechanical. "Captain, this isn't about the past. It's about procedure. You can either cooperate or we'll have to reschedule the transport." Something in Thomas broke. Not into rage, but into clarity. "You think you can hide behind paperwork again," he said quietly, "but not this time." Langford gestured to the security officers. "Please remove him." Phones lifted again, recording. Thomas didn't move, didn't even flinch as the officers approached. "You'll have to lay hands on a soldier's flag to do it," he said, voice carrying across the terminal. The officers hesitated. One, a young man barely 30, stepped forward but his hand trembled. The flag between them was not just cloth anymore. It was a line drawn between honor and convenience. Langford's radio buzzed, her voice cracking slightly as she stepped back to answer. Thomas caught fragments. "Contain. PR team. No physical contact." The crowd had grown now. 40, 50, maybe more. Someone shouted, "Let him take the boy home." Applause followed, scattered but rising. Langford's eyes darted across the growing scene. Thomas met her gaze one last time. "You can stop the flight," he said, "but you can't stop what people remember when they see this." Then came the twist no one saw coming. A voice called out from the edge of the crowd. Deep, cracked, familiar. "Captain Hale." Thomas turned. A man stood by the arrival corridor in civilian clothes, beard gray, eyes burning. He wore a service pin from the same unit, Carter's unit. "Sir," the man said, stepping forward, voice shaking. "You don't know me. I was with Liam Carter the day he died. There's something you need to know. He wasn't supposed to be on that convoy. Someone switched his assignment." The words hit harder than any bullet. Langford froze. Thomas's vision tunneled, the edges of the world closing in. "What did you just say?" The man swallowed. Orders came from a base clerk, unsigned, no chain. Someone needed a cover transport. Carter volunteered. That order came from HQ Logistics. Langford's face drained of color. The crowd, unaware of the storm that had just cracked open, only saw a veteran refusing to yield. But Thomas knew. Beneath the flag lay not only a fallen soldier, but the first thread of a betrayal that had just begun to unravel. And for the first time in years, he felt something sharp and alive course through his veins, not grief, not duty, but vengeance waking from its long sleep. For a moment, the entire terminal seemed to stop breathing. The hum of conversation, the distant roll of luggage wheels, even the overhead announcements fell into a strange, suspended silence, as if the building itself was waiting to hear what would happen next. The man who had stepped forward, grizzled, haunted with a service pin worn smooth by years of rubbing, stood before Thomas with trembling hands. His voice had carried across the crowd like a bell tolling for unfinished business, and every syllable had settled into Thomas's bones like shrapnel that had waited too long to hurt. "Say that again," Thomas said, his voice low, steady, dangerous. The man swallowed hard. Private Carter was never meant to be on that transport. He was filling in for an intel officer, someone who was supposed to ride along and inspect a shipment. There was a switch, sir. No paperwork, no authorization, but Carter took the slot. He said the officer had a family and had already been out there too long. He volunteered. Thomas's throat went dry. "Who signed off?" The man hesitated. The order came through base logistics. A woman named Langford. Every eye turned toward her. R. Langford stood rigid near the frosted office door, her jaw tightening as if she could hold back time by sheer will. Her security badge caught the light, flashing gold like a medal turned mockery. "That's not possible," she said quickly, her voice shaking just slightly. "Those files were declassified years ago. Anyone can make up." Thomas stepped forward, closing the distance between them, his boots striking the tiled floor like slow thunder. "You denied medevac clearance in 2013, he said quietly. "And now I find you were also behind the assignment that sent Carter to his death. How many decisions did you make behind a desk that cost men their lives?" Gasps rippled through the crowd. The phones rose again, recording, the scene spreading live into the invisible bloodstream of the internet. But Langford wasn't beaten yet. She straightened, her corporate armor reassembled with a single breath. "Captain Hale," she said, her voice controlled. "This isn't a war zone. This is a civilian airport. If you don't stop this performance, you'll be detained under federal code for obstructing transport security." Thomas smiled without warmth. "Do what you need to do. But you'll explain your orders right here, in front of them." He pointed toward the gathering crowd, the citizens who had turned a bureaucratic hallway into a courtroom of witnesses. Langford's radio buzzed again. "Ma'am," a voice hissed, "media feed's already live." "We're trending. Don't escalate." Her hand dropped from the radio as color drained from her face. The supervisor beside her looked pale and helpless, caught between his loyalty to his employer and the unmistakable moral gravity of what he was seeing. The man who had spoken, the veteran, stepped forward again, his voice cracking. "I had the report, ma'am. I was ordered to destroy it. But I didn't." He reached into his jacket, pulling out a folded document wrapped in a plastic sleeve. The seal on it was military, faint but unmistakable. He handed it to Thomas. Thomas unfolded it carefully. The air seemed to hold its breath again. The document bore an authorization code from the Department of Defense Logistics Division, signed not by Langford directly, but by someone under her clearance. Yet the approval stamp, her digital signature, was right there, faint but real. The crowd murmured. A whisper rose, carried by disbelief. She signed it. Langford's composure fractured. That's old information, she snapped. You have no idea the context. The context, Thomas said, eyes narrowing, is that you sent a boy into a convoy that never should have rolled, carrying supplies meant for a ghost operation. Carter died in an explosion that shouldn't have happened, and now you stand here telling me about procedure. He stepped closer, holding the flag tighter. You see this? His hand rested on the casket. This is what your context looks like when it comes home. Langford tried to speak, but the words tangled. You don't understand, Captain. Orders came from higher up. There were arrangements. Arrangements, Thomas echoed. To cover what? She hesitated. Then too quickly, that's classified. The crowd reacted, angry murmurs, disbelief, rising outrage. Someone shouted, She's admitting it! Another yelled, That soldier died for your cover-up. Security shifted uneasily. The younger guard looked ready to quit his job right there. Langford's phone vibrated. She glanced down, her hand trembling. Thomas caught a glimpse of the message flashing on the screen before she turned it away. Contain Hale. Do not engage further. HQ inbound, HQ inbound. Thomas's heart tightened. Someone higher was watching, moving. The battle wasn't over. It was just changing fronts. Langford looked up again, trying to compose herself. Captain Hale, I'm asking you one last time to step aside. He straightened, shoulders squared like a man standing before an unseen firing line. And I'm asking you to remember what the uniform once meant, before you traded it for a suit and a salary. A quiet fell again. The crowd's loyalty had already shifted. They weren't seeing a scene anymore. They were witnessing a reckoning. Thomas turned to the veteran. You'll give this report to the proper people, he said. And if you can, make copies. Many copies. Then he looked back at Langford. This flight will leave on schedule, he said evenly, and that boy will go home. But your war, he added, is just beginning. As he turned back to the casket, the crowd began to clap again, louder now, a wave of human sound rising against the sterile hum of the terminal. Langford's phone buzzed once more, another message flashing across it. Stop him before it reaches the airfield. She paled. The words made her throat tighten. Because now, for the first time, even she realized, this was no longer just about a delayed flight. Someone had something to lose if that casket reached its destination. And whatever it was, Thomas Hale was about to uncover it. The revelation, the past returns. The airport lights burned too bright, casting everything in sterile clarity. But Thomas could feel the shadows thickening around him. The crowd's applause faded into uneasy murmurs as more uniformed staff appeared at the edges of the gate area. Some wearing security badges, others corporate credentials that meant something colder than authority. Langford had retreated to a corner, her phone pressed tight against her ear, whispering in the controlled panic of someone who knew the walls were closing in. Thomas could tell by her body language she wasn't calling local management. She was calling someone far above them. The veteran, his name was Sergeant Mason Cole, stayed near the casket, shoulders squared, as if ready to defend it with his life. Thomas handed him the folded report. Keep that safe, he said quietly. Don't trust anyone in a suit. Mason nodded, slipping it into his jacket. Sir, he murmured, if what I think is true, this goes deeper than logistics. Carter wasn't just covering an intel officer's shift. He was standing in for someone carrying classified cargo. Thomas's pulse slowed. Classified cargo? Yes, sir. The convoy's manifest listed humanitarian supplies, but the numbers didn't match. Too many crates, too much security for food and medicine. After the explosion, they sealed the files and buried the report. Mason's eyes flicked toward Langford. That's why she's panicking. If that casket gets opened back home, if anyone looks at what's inside, the lie unravels. Thomas's stomach turned. What's inside? Mason hesitated. Sir, it's not just Carter. There was something else loaded into the vehicle. A containment unit, marked DoD Experimental. It wasn't supposed to be there. A chill rippled through Thomas. You're saying the convoy was a cover for an unauthorized transfer, Mason finished. Carter died because someone needed that transport to disappear. The air in the terminal thickened. Thomas looked at the casket again. The flag bright against dull metal, and for the first time a terrible possibility took shape. The reason the airline wanted to delay the flight wasn't just bureaucracy, it was instruction. Someone was trying to keep that casket from reaching its destination because it carried more than a fallen soldier's body. Langford ended her call and turned sharply, her face composed but drained of color. "Captain Hale," she said, "I've just spoken to federal authorities. The casket is now under investigation. You'll have to relinquish custody immediately." Thomas's voice came out low and steady. "On what grounds?" "National security," she said. The words dropped like a hammer. The crowd shifted uneasily, sensing something larger than grief unfolding before them. Thomas took a step forward. "National security is what men like Carter died defending," he said, "not what cowards use to bury their mistakes." Langford's expression flickered. Fear, guilt, calculation. "You don't understand what's at stake," she said sharply. "You think this is about respect. It's bigger than that. If this gets out, careers end. People go to prison, alliances fall apart. We're protecting stability." "Stability?" Thomas's tone turned razor-edged. "By erasing the dead?" "By keeping order," she snapped. Thomas leaned closer. "You kept order in 2013, didn't you? Denied a medevac, ordered silence. And now you're doing it again." Her jaw clenched. "You don't know what it cost me to make that call." "Then maybe it's time everyone else does." Mason's phone buzzed. He glanced down, eyes narrowing. "Sir," he whispered, "they've grounded our flight. Every outgoing plane delayed indefinitely." Thomas looked past the crowd toward the glass windows where the gray morning had turned storm-colored. It wasn't weather. It was interference. Someone somewhere was buying time. He turned back to Langford. "You think you can outwait me?" he said. "I've outweighted men with guns, storms, and death itself. You're just another obstacle." Her voice wavered. "You don't get it, do you? You weren't supposed to find out. Carter's death wasn't an accident. It was a cleanup." The world stopped. Even Mason froze, the words sinking like lead into the air between them. Thomas's mind reeled. "Cleanup?" Langford's eyes flicked to the crowd, then back to him. "He knew something," she said, almost whispering now. "He intercepted a report. He was going to expose the operation. You had to what?" Thomas cut in. Her lips parted, but the sentence never finished. A sharp crack split the air, a sound not meant for terminals or civilians. A window pane exploded somewhere behind the crowd. Screams erupted. Mason lunged forward instinctively, dragging the casket down behind the counter as people scattered. Security radios erupted with chaos. "Shots fired, North Concourse." Thomas dropped beside Mason, his old training kicking in with terrifying clarity. "Stay down," he hissed. Langford crouched nearby, eyes wide with shock. For the first time, she looked genuinely afraid, not of Thomas, but of whoever was coming for them. The bullet hole in the glass door smoked faintly, the wind from outside whistling through it like a warning. "Who fired that?" Mason demanded, scanning the terminal. Langford's voice trembled. "Not airport security. They wouldn't dare. This is something else." Thomas's hand tightened on the edge of the casket. "They're silencing witnesses." He turned to her, fury and realization colliding. "You started something you can't control, and now you've brought it here." Langford's phone buzzed again. She hesitated, then handed it to him. A message glowed on the screen, short, cold, and final. "Retrieve the cargo. Terminate exposure." Thomas's pulse thundered. "Cargo. Not body. Cargo." He looked down at the flag-draped casket, his breath catching. The storm outside broke, lightning flashing across the windows, thunder rolling like cannon fire. Whatever had been buried with Private Liam Carter wasn't just a secret. It was something someone was willing to kill for. And as the sirens began to scream across the terminal, Thomas realized that bringing him home might mean uncovering the very thing that had destroyed him. He whispered under his breath, "Not a prayer but a promise. You saved me once, son," he said. "Now it's my turn." And then another shot, closer. The casket shuddered. The showdown. Honor versus power. The bullet had torn a neat hole through the plexiglass wall, but the chaos it unleashed was anything but neat. Passengers screamed and ducked behind seats. Luggage tumbled, alarms howled through the terminal like a wounded animal. Security scrambled, unsure whether to evacuate or contain. But through the bedlam, Thomas Hale did not move from his post beside the flag-draped casket. His body had entered that old familiar rhythm, heart steady, breath measured, awareness sharpened to the edge of instinct. The years of retirement had not dulled the part of him that knew how to survive a firefight. Langford crouched nearby, her voice breaking. "We have to get out of here. They'll kill us both." Thomas turned, his face carved from stone. "You're only half right. They came for you, and for what's inside this." His gloved hand rested over the flag as if shielding it from the world. "But I'm not leaving him again." The younger officer, barely more than a kid, ran toward them, ducking low. "Sir, they're sealing off the terminal. SWAT's on its way, but the shooter's gone silent." "Silent means repositioning," Thomas said grimly. "Keep your people back." Langford shook her head, clutching her phone. "You don't understand, Captain. If that casket opens here, we'll have a war on every screen in the country." He fixed her with a gaze that could have melted glass. "Then maybe it's time people saw what their wars really look like." She stared at him, then at the casket, and something inside her cracked. For the first time, her voice lost the armor. "You think I wanted this?" she said. "I was a logistics officer. I followed orders. We all did. But when I realized what was happening, it was already too late." "What was happening?" Thomas asked quietly. Her throat worked as she tried to form the words. "Project Haven, a weapons test. Biogenic data compression, they called it. They used field units to move samples. Carter's convoy wasn't carrying aid, it was carrying classified material. Human material." Thomas felt his chest tighten. "Human? Genetic mapping from fallen soldiers," she whispered. "They were experimenting, trying to create a database to predict combat aptitude. They said it would save lives, but when the story leaked, they buried the evidence. Carter was going to expose them. They eliminated the convoy, called it an insurgent strike. The revelation landed like a strike to the gut." Thomas's mind reeled, flashing back to Carter's grin under desert sun, his laughter about going home, his talk about truth and fairness. He'd been a soldier who still believed in right and wrong, and for that they'd erased him. "Why tell me now?" Thomas demanded. "Because it's too big to stop anymore," she said. "They'll kill us both, Captain. But you have something they don't, the public. You've already lit the fuse." The veteran Mason returned, breathing hard. "Sir, the back exits are blocked. Someone locked down the gates. But the crowd, sir, they're staying. They won't leave. They're chanting your name." Thomas glanced past him. Dozens of passengers were still in the terminal despite the chaos, standing shoulder to shoulder, holding up phones. The ripple of human resolve moved through them like a wave, a defiant wall of witnesses. "Then we finish this," Thomas said. He stood, his movements deliberate, controlled. "Help me lift the casket." Mason and another man from the crowd stepped forward. Together they raised it onto a rolling trolley. The flag fluttered once, catching the artificial breeze from the ventilation above, as if the soul beneath it was listening. Langford grabbed his arm. "If you open it, they'll shoot you before you finish." Thomas met her eyes. "They already tried." As the crowd watched, he wheeled the casket into the open space before the gate windows, framed by sunlight breaking through the storm clouds outside. "This boy deserves truth," he said, his voice carrying like a sermon. "And if that truth costs lives, then maybe those lives were never worth protecting." The crowd hushed. Langford's lips parted, desperate to stop him. "Don't do this, Captain. If that seal breaks, you'll expose classified lies," he interrupted. He reached for the latch. Mason tensed beside him. The world seemed to shrink to the sound of one man's heartbeat, one trembling breath. Then, before his hand touched the seal, Langford's phone rang. The ringtone sliced through the silence like a knife. She looked down, pale as paper. "It's HQ," she whispered. Thomas didn't wait. He snatched the phone and pressed it to his ear. "This is Hale," a pause. Then a voice, smooth, male-controlled. "Captain Hale, you don't know what you're involved in. Walk away and we forget this happened." "Who am I speaking to?" "Someone who's cleaned up bigger messes than you can imagine." Thomas's jaw tightened. "You murdered one of my men. Collateral. Don't make yourself another." He glanced at the flag, then back at the window. "You can't bury honor forever." The line clicked dead. Thomas tossed the phone aside. "They're not stopping that plane," he said. "We're flying him home." Outside, engines roared as ground crew vehicles moved, except Thomas noticed something wrong. The jet meant to carry the casket wasn't being fueled. It was being emptied. Langford followed his gaze and blanched. "They're removing the cargo hold panels. They're going to destroy it before it leaves." Thomas's pulse thundered. "Not if I'm on it." He grabbed the trolley, motioning for Mason to follow. The crowd parted instinctively like witnesses making way for a procession. Every phone lifted, every lens turned toward him as he pushed the casket toward the loading bay. Langford shouted after him, "You'll die if you go out there." He looked back once. "Then I'll die doing something that matters." As the sliding doors to the tarmac opened, the wind roared in, wild and cold, whipping the flag around him like a living flame. Storm clouds split above the runway, lightning flashing over the gleaming metal of the waiting jet. Thomas's figure, silhouetted in the doorway, seemed carved against the storm itself, a man walking straight into the fire he'd been running from his whole life. Somewhere behind him, Mason whispered, "God help him." And ahead, out on the wind-swept tarmac, figures in black were already waiting. The resolution, the journey home. The wind howled across the tarmac, carrying with it the taste of rain and jet fuel. Lightning flickered somewhere beyond the hangars, illuminating the silhouettes waiting near the plane. Men in black windbreakers, faces expressionless, movements sharp and military. They weren't airport staff. Thomas recognized the stance, the synchronization. These were operatives, the kind used when governments wanted actions without witnesses. He stopped beside the cargo lift, the casket gleaming under the flashing red beacon. Mason stayed close, scanning the shadows. "Sir," he whispered, "we can't win a gunfight out here." Thomas didn't answer. He was studying the jet, the way the ground crew avoided eye contact, the missing fuel lines, the subtle hum from the open cargo hold. They weren't preparing for departure. They were preparing for destruction. Langford ran up behind them, soaked and breathless. "Hale, listen to me!" she shouted over the wind. "They're going to destroy the evidence and the casket, the manifest, everything. They've authorized a controlled detonation. You need to get back inside." Thomas turned slowly, eyes cold. "Then stop them." "I can't," she said. Her voice cracked. "They've locked me out. I'm not command anymore. I'm the leak they're cleaning up." For the first time, Thomas saw her not as an enemy, but as another casualty of the same machine. "Then help me expose them." She nodded once, defeated. "If we can get the black box in the cargo bay, it records every coded transmission for the last 48 hours. It'll prove the operation." "But we only have minutes." Thunder cracked overhead, the rain beginning to fall hard and fast, smearing the runway in silver. Thomas glanced at Mason. "Stay with the casket." "No one touches it," Mason saluted sharply. "Yes, sir." Thomas and Langford ran for the plane. The operatives advanced at the same time, 6 of them, forming a half-circle near the cargo door. One called out through the storm, voice metallic through a comms headset. "Captain Hale, step away. You're interfering with a federal operation." Thomas didn't slow. "I've been interfering with lies my whole life," he said. They drew weapons, not rifles, but compact silenced pistols. Thomas raised his hands halfway. "If you shoot me, the world will see it live." He nodded toward the terminal windows where dozens of phones were still recording through the glass. The agents hesitated, shifting. That hesitation was all he needed. He dove for the loading ramp, dragging Langford down with him as the first suppressed shot hissed past his shoulder. The bullet struck metal, sending sparks into the rain. He rolled, slammed the emergency lock lever, and the ramp sealed with a mechanical hiss. They were inside the cargo bay. Langford pulled open a maintenance panel and yanked free a black box no bigger than a lunch pail. "This records everything," she said breathlessly. "All transmissions, authorizations, drone feeds. If you get this out, it proves Carter was killed to cover the project." Thomas stared at the device, the heartbeat of truth cold and humming in her hands. "We'll get it home," he said. The floor beneath them shuddered. A warning alarm blared. Langford's eyes widened. "They've armed the detonator. Where?" "In the fuselage, under the secondary compartment." Thomas ran, boots clanging against the metal floor, memory flashing back to desert nights and dying men, the smell of dust and blood. He found the hatch, ripped it open, and saw the device, small military grade, blinking a cruel red. Less than 2 minutes, Langford joined him, face pale. "We can't disarm it," she said. "Not in time." Thomas looked toward the casket, visible through the cargo door window, the flag rippling in the wind. "Then we make sure it doesn't die for nothing." He ripped the flag from the case, wrapped the black box inside it, and pressed it into Langford's hands. "You're getting on that service vehicle," he said. Take this straight to the media. The world deserves to know. She shook her head violently. They'll kill me. He smiled faintly. They'll be too busy with me. Before she could protest, he slammed the bay door lever down, sealing her outside. Through the glass, he saw her pounding on it, shouting something he couldn't hear. Thomas turned back to the casket and placed both hands on it. We're going home, Liam, he whispered. No one's taking that from us. He climbed into the pilot's seat in the small tug vehicle attached to the plane, started it, and pushed the throttle. The jet lurched forward just as the operatives broke through the door. Their shouts vanished in the roar of engines. Inside the terminal, hundreds watched through the windows as the plane began to roll. A few realized what was happening, the cargo fire, the impending blast, and screamed. But Thomas wasn't listening anymore. His mind was quiet, peaceful, like a soldier who had finally found the right hill to die on. At the far end of the runway, the explosion bloomed like a sunrise. A soundless shockwave rolled across the glass as the jet vanished into a white fireball. The flag, torn loose in the blast, drifted upward, glowing red and gold before falling gently to the wet tarmac. Hours later, when the smoke cleared and the news networks began piecing the footage together, a miracle emerged from the wreckage, the flag intact wrapped around the black box. Langford had survived and delivered it to the press. The recordings exposed everything, the falsified orders, the deaths, the cover-ups. The nation mourned a soldier it never knew, and honored the man who refused to let him be erased. At the small-town airfield 3 days later, Liam Carter was finally laid to rest under a clean sky. The casket was empty when what remained had burned, but the ceremony was full. Langford stood beside Carter's mother, tears unhidden. Mason placed the flag on the stand, saluting. The minister spoke softly. Greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for his brother. Langford turned to the crowd. He kept his promise, she said. He brought him home. And somewhere in the rustle of trees beyond the field, the wind seemed to whisper back. Steady, proud, unbroken. In the end, the story was not about death or vengeance. It was about redemption, the kind that costs everything but buys peace. Thomas Hale had become what every soldier hopes to be when the last order fades, a man who did the right thing, no matter how impossible it was. And in doing so, he reminded a weary nation that honor, true honor, never dies.